All right, this is a social disorder s- op-ed. This is a social disorder op-ed, and I want to talk about the diaspora war between Black Americans and the rest of the diaspora. I call this the bloodiest, bloodless war that ever hit the internet because of the fact of the discussions of Black American cultural and political, because this is kind of political, um, genealogy, we should say, meaning that the basis of Black American culture is deeply rooted in a foreign nationality, a foreign entity, to say the least. Now, we can, I can rehash the transatlantic slave trade. I can rehash chattel slavery here in America, and basically a whole bunch of other historical points that created Black Americans. To be quite honest, Black Americans were actually created. That is to say, we are an amalgamation of three different racial and genetic sects. One is the European, one is the Native American, because there are factual records, and another one is the African, which is also known. The two main ones that we always go by is the European and the African, but we rarely talk about the amalgamation of Native American tribes within Black America. Within recent times, due to the fact of reparations for Black Americans, those that descended from child slavery, those who were the foundation that built America that everything stands upon. And everybody either has a negative opinion on it or believes that they should get something out of it, which is retarded. Which is retarded. I'll give you a good comparison of this. If CARICOM, which is a Caribbean organization that all the Caribbean islands from Jamaica, Panama, Cuba, Colombia, all those Caribbean island nations, because they are nations, have got together to make their own UN of sorts. And they charge the EU for past transgressions, which Haiti has done, which a number of other countries have done. There would be no mentioning of Black Americans, seeing as how they are not part of CARICOM or any of those Caribbean nations. Now, there are descendants um, from those countries in the modern era who would get something because of their cultural and genealogically ancestry and heritage from Jamaica. But for the majority of Black Americans, they would get none. And even if they'll find a great 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 grandpa back in 1786, that still wouldn't make sense, because the island of Jamaica during that time was not the nation that it is now. The government of Jamaica back in 1786 is not the government now in 2025. It doesn't make any sense, which is why it's very, very upsetting to find other people within the diaspora who said, hey, I grew up in America all my life. I've assimilated the Black culture. Where's my reparations? It's like your lineage does not come from here. Your lineage comes from somewhere else. Are you and your people owed? Yes. Yes, we are. Yes, they are. but you're not owed American reparations. And if you are owed American reparations, then your nation has to put out their own grievance against your nation. You're not going to be able to do that as an individual here in America. And even if the entire population of that foreign lineage decides on their own, they would have to go through state, then through federal for their petition to be looked at. And even then, you would have to get permission from your own nation that exists today to go on behalf for them. And that's a long process. Black Americans don't have to do that because we are already citizens. If you go back, and I don't care what definition you look at, I don't care if you look at Black's definition, the Oxford definition, Black Americans who have been citizens for over 12, 20 generations already have their citizenship. So we can already put out a grievance to our capital, to our nation, through state, through federal, and not have to worry about a foreign entity. But like the biggest thing is that all these other nations, or all these other people of other nations, are trying their best to claim Black American cultures, talking about the cultural influences and the inflections and how your music is just offshoots of African music, which is not the case. You can talk about where the instruments were first made and whatnot. That's absolutely fine. But that has nothing to do with the impact that was created by a certain lineage. Okay, cool. So an ancient African made the guitar. Did the prehistoric version of the guitar. That's cool. The music that was made then is not the music that is made now. Especially if there was a break. If there was a break into it, then there is no cultural lineage continuing through. That doesn't make sense. Like, you can talk about how Asians played string instruments and find the cultural lineage. Okay, not only that, but the progression and evolution of those string instruments. You can find that. Doesn't necessarily mean that if there's a break into it, if there's a break in the cultural lineage, then someone's coming up with something completely different. Using that same instrument, they're not going to play the same notes as them. They're not going to come up with the same patterns and melodies. It doesn't make sense. That's why it's so frustrating when we have these continued discussions. Just because there are similarities, the cultural markers are not the same. It depends on how the society was built. It was then on how the people adapted and built. It was on how language was used. You can't just say something derived from an ancient ancestor and there is a cultural genealogical break in between. Because then now these people are just learning something that happened in the past. You can't do that. And that's the biggest insult. And that is the biggest insult. I was looking on Twitter and I forgot this guy's name or whatever posted, but he was on Side Netter's show. And this is just a clip, but he was talking about how the largest group of African slaves came from the Caribbean. That's all well and good. But we're not talking about cultural Caribbeans. We're talking about slaves being transported from one area to another, from one society to another. So they have to readapt to a different society, a different political structure, a different cultural structure. And whatever influences they had while being on the Caribbean islands, that slowly dissipates and amalgamates into a whole nother culture. I mean, the best example I can give is voodoo. New Orleans voodoo versus Caribbean voodoo are two totally different things. You can look at Haitians, you can look at Dominicans, you can look at even Jamaicans who practice voodoo. Unless you're talking, we go back to Colombians and Cubans and everything. They practice Santeria. So even Dominicans, they practice Santeria. But you can see the cultural similarities within that. You can see the cultural similarities, the markers going in those groups when it comes to that religion. When it comes to voodoo and Santeria, you can see that, and you can go through the whole entire history. The difference is that there was a break. Even if they were transporting back and forth, most of them were not slaves at that time. Most of them were just merchant sailors. But the culture of voodoo in New Orleans is way different than the culture of voodoo it is in the Caribbean. They may be similarities, but how it's performed and revered is totally different than it is in the Caribbean. It became a different amalgamation. And to just say it's just an offshoot is very, very disrespectful. And I think that's what the biggest thing is. Secondly, for people to say Black Americans don't have a culture, why does everybody look at Black Americans for the culture? That's the biggest thing ever. Why someone who had to create a culture for themselves have their culture distributed across the world? And everybody can import to say, oh, that's American. That's American. That came from, that's something from America. You can't take that and be like, well, what y'all doing is just an offshoot of some ancient African tribal stuff. That is so disrespectful. Just because there's similarities. The culture behind it, the understanding behind it, the impact behind it is totally different. Because mostly, all African culture stay mainly enclosed. If anything, if anybody wanted to experience any type of African culture, they went to a museum because of all the shit that was stolen. But for people to experience Black American culture, they have to go to Black Americans to experience the culture and then take it somewhere. Because that's how impactful Black American culture is. Another thing that really grinds my gears is that I know this was a movie. It's called We Are the Beast of No Nation. That's Black Americans in a nutshell. That is Black Americans in a nutshell. We are a nation with no nation. And there is no nation, no Caribbean, no African nation that can fully claim Black Americans. We can take a genealogy DNA test, and if something says I'm 50% Nigerian, 20% Cameroonian, 13% Eritrean, and 32% 32% European. What does that mean? DNA wise, that doesn't tell me what tribe I came from. That doesn't tell me what cultural markers that my ancestors have. That doesn't tell me anything. It just tells me that bits and pieces of my DNA are from here and from here and from here. Especially if you're talking about Nigeria. Nigeria, there are several different tribes. I know of 5. The Yoruba, the Igbo, the Fulani, the Hutsa. Sorry, 4. I only know 4. And I know jack shit of them. Okay? But that's the truth. You can't just say I'm from Nigeria, but what cultural tribe am I from? That doesn't make any sense. You can't say I'm from Kenya and forget that Kenya in and of itself is an amalgamation. They got Indians there. Same as South Africa. South Africa got Indians. They're called colored people. The original Zulus are in shanty towns. If not, they're in their own spaces. But even then, that's still a country, a multicultural country. most of these countries are multicultural. Algeria's multicultural. Well, if you're talking about religious wise, I think they're mainly Muslim and Christian. Kenyans mainly Christian. Mali, Burkina Faso have some Muslim influences. They also have different tribes there. So to say that a black American is just a generic African is downright insulting. The next thing is that we cannot give up our cultural milestones and heritage and give it up to some person who wasn't there. That goes to the whole absent mother, absent father thing. You weren't there to help build me up. Yes, I was taken from you, but I learned nothing from you. I had to learn this on my own and make this on my own. How you want me to give you guys praise for something I built on my own? I understand you guys were doing your own shit, but y'all didn't come to get me. And to be quite honest, within American history, there have been Africans coming from back and forth since past the 1600s. Since before the 1600s. Documented. Go look it up. Google that shit. But to say that Africans came to America and was like, I want to buy some of these slaves and take them back to Africa. That's not what happened. A lot of the times, they were just trying to either send us away or send us on our own. Hence why we were able to build a culture. I forgot the name of this place. They had such a convoluted name, but basically, a group of white slave owners who didn't want another slave revolt happen, gathered a bunch of Africans I'm not gonna say African, but gathered a bunch of black American slaves and were like, hey, we'll send y'all back to Africa. We got this patch of land, we bought it, which is weird because who did they buy it from? And we're going to have you build a town over there. And you can just go over there. And the reason it took off, because a lot was like, yeah, fuck America. We'll go build our own. Problem is, those same white people were there too, overseeing the operation. So now you're over there and you never learn how to build a society on your own without supervision. You're just following what you've already seen. So you're building a society based on oppression and slavery, thinking that's how things go. That's why Liberia got fucked up, because the newly freed slaves from America went to Liberia. Some of them died because they had to amalgamate themselves to a whole nother ecosystem. They had to get to know the tribes that were already there and build an entire town or an entire civilization for themselves on top of the supervision of white folks who use them to, one, make war with the natives, but two, mine resources that they took back to America. That's the biggest part of the history of Liberia. Okay? But to say that was a perfect plan, it wasn't. It wasn't about a perfect plan. It was just a new way of exploitation. This time we're just paying you. That was the whole thing. We'll give you money and then you can go build this society over here for yourselves, but we're going to start taking the resources and using them elsewhere. But we're paying you, so you're not really, being exploited, but they were still being exploited. Which is what happened back here in America. When we stopped working for them, they made laws to where we'd be forced to work for them. When we had our own there, they didn't like it and made it fucking hard to just maintain it. We built it and we tried to maintain it, but they found some way to just stick their fingers in here. That's how we built a culture of resilience. We knew they were going to come around and start fucking with us. And then just to give it that, because we have the African spirit. If I'm separated from my parents for And I'm started as not only, let's just say, I'm just started as a 13-year-old child. I'm going to slowly forget. I'm going to slowly forget all that was built because of my immediate situation. And whatever I learn within my 12, 13 years, I'm going to have to learn to carry on that. And then if I grow up and become of reading age, I'm going to have to find someone who I can actually see following my lead. And then we build something together so we can always keep each other's back and always make sure that we have something. And then teach that to the youngins. They're not going to teach our old ways from the old country, especially if you come out 12, 13 years old or as young as 4 or 5. Those cultural ties are being cut as they grow up. Plus, with the constant oppression, you can't claim no foreign parentage after that. Because that's all you. You got to find people that are going to help you. That's what's upsetting. We can't give somebody who wasn't there our accolades and our accomplishments just because there's a genetic signature that leads back to there. And it's not saying going there and understanding that part of you, but that doesn't change the fact that you have a whole other part of you that you built up over here. Understanding a small portion doesn't take care of that big chunk. It just completes the circle. And I don't know why most people in the diaspora don't get that. Another thing about it is that because we Black Americans are a people of no nation within a nation, there is no nation that gives us political support. Social support, sure, but political support is totally different. I'll give you the biggest example. A lot of Black Americans that leave to go and live anywhere in Africa, they have to come. I don't want to say with hat in hand. Well, yeah, with hat in hand. They have to come with all their belongings, all their money, and build up a life here in Africa. A life not here, a life there in Africa. They have to bring their resources, their ingenuity, their innovation to a country and build up that country with no political standing, no social standing, learning new laws, new customs, a whole different culture. And your culture has to go underneath it just so you can adapt to the new culture that you're in. And you still got to build a life. And there are a lot of big successes in Africa, like our Black Americans in Africa, but to say that we come in a nation, we're coming and they rightfully accept us, that's not what happened. You still got to go for citizenship. You still got to learn to adapt. You still got to build a life. They don't see you as one of them. And this is like the major population. The biggest example right now, Earn Your Leisure has struck a deal with, I think, Ghana. They were given 200 acres to build a project city. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Like, it's a giant building construction project that they built with Earn Your Leisure, which I do believe is a good, if everything's going to open up, that is a good buy-in. But they still have to come and bring resources and build something for people to get behind, for the country to get behind and start funding. If we were actually of that lineage and of that nation of origin, then automatically we should be getting some type of grant, some type of housing and building stipend, so we can start off on a solid footing, but that's not how it goes. That's not how it goes. We have to bring our resources and build for ourselves a life in a new country. And that is like one of the biggest frustrations people don't understand. Just because you take a DNA result and it says you're a percentage here and a percentage there and a percentage there, that doesn't tell you anything about cultural or national heritage. It doesn't. And for people to be like, well, that's an offshoot of Africa, that has African influence over here, that when they're talking about Black American culture, then insult it more, saying you don't have a culture. The only reason I can come up with people coming over and saying you don't have a culture while biting off the culture is the fact that the culture is so freely accessible. So people don't have to give credit to the people who created it. So foreigners don't have to give credit to the people who created it, because it's so freely accessible. And because Black Americans are now getting codified and holding on to their culture, are pointing out the fact that, hey, we made things pop, we made things popular and interesting, that made people turn their heads, and want to see what's going on. That ruffles a lot of people's feathers, because that's true. That is 100% true. We made things popular. A lot of stuff that white people did didn't become popular until we were in it. Okay? The only thing I could give any kind of shout out to is baseball, because Babe Ruth made baseball popular. Now, whether he's a tragic mulatto, a quadroon, or whatnot, that remains to be seen. But he did hang with the brothers. Okay? He did hang with the brothers, and, he must have had that swag, because that's how people saw him. But other than that, because Black Americans are really pulling back their cultural heritage that was made here and holding on, and everybody is either trying to be erased, or is trying to be I won't say assimilated, and have other different nationalities put their stamp on it before we fully grab our ball and take all the stuff off the shelves and put it in storage and say, this is ours. We're just locking it up. And that is the biggest feather ruffler when it comes to this whole diaspora war. It's not that we're trying to deny that we have, even though it seems like it when it comes to these discussions and debates and whatnot. What's really going on is the fact that we're holding on to what our ancestors built here. Regardless of how many people came over during the 1700s, they still had to adapt and assimilate in a different culture. So they stopped being Jamaicans or Haitians if they were transported from there to America, and they assimilate into a different whole entire culture. They're not Haitians anymore. They're not Jamaicans anymore. They're Creole. They're Cajun. They're Gullah Geechee. They're Black Americans. They're Seminoles. It is what it is. It's the same way that even though we have Black Americans who did go to Haiti, who did go to Mexico, if they stayed there and whatever remnants of the culture that they have, they are now their own separate people, because they've been there for more than 10 years. They're their own people. And that's not a bad thing. They created a culture heritage for themselves. That's not a bad thing. The bad thing comes in is when you're trying to take the culture heritage of something that is known to be popular, known to be impactful, and then try to put your stamp on it. That's just ain't cool. But that's just my opinion on it. Like, share, survive. Definitely comment on how you feel about this diaspora war. And y'all have a good night. And always remember, there's always order in some chaos.